Welcome to Under the Rug at Work, where I shine light on things that are normally swept under the rug. Today, I'm chatting with Dr. Helen Lawson Williams about emotions, and we're going to do some mythbusters. Helen has a PhD in organizational psychology and is the co founder of Tank, the app that fights burnout. Thank you so much for joining me, Helen.
Thanks for the invite, Nick. Super excited.
Yeah, it's a good topic. And I think we need to start off first, though, with why is it important for us to talk about emotions?
Ooh, so many good reasons. I think the main things that really strike me, when you're asking me what I wanted to talk about as far as the critical parts of the burnout system, rather than try to tackle the whole system, I think the thing about emotions is they're so poorly understood. There are so many myths around them, and at the same time, they're so important in keeping ourselves well. And using them skillfully is not something that we spend a lot of time talking about or learning about. So that's really the gap, like of the four things in the burnout system. That's really the gap that I think is most interesting to talk about today.
Yeah, definitely. And so, getting really basic, because you're definitely the person to chat to about this, why do we have emotions? What are they for?
Ooh, they keep us alive, is the quick answer. They have evolved over the millions and millions of years that humans have been evolving. And their purpose is really to alert us to something that's changed in the environment that we either need to do something about really quickly, or that could be advantageous to us, which I guess is another way of saying we need to do something about. We need to either avoid it, run away from it, or we need to approach it, understand it, benefit from it. So an emotion is really your brain's way of saying there's something out there that you need to, that's probably interesting enough for you to react to. So it's a way of alerting you to a need or an opportunity that you need to act on.
Mm. And what comes to mind for me when you were saying that is the fight, flight, freeze response in those extreme situations is, trying to protect us, to get us out of a dangerous situation. Is there anything you wanted to add to that at all?
Yeah, I think that is a really good example of a series of reactions, which are physical reactions. It's your brain creating a physical reaction that's raising cortisol. First of all, it's releasing adrenaline, and then if that threat persists, it's raising your cortisol level so that you've got a really strong reaction to whatever's happened in the environment. That's not to say that that physical response is actually, so acting on that physical response is actually in your best interest. Your brain is doing the best that it can under the circumstances based on what it's experienced in the past, what's worked for it in the past, and it's making its best guess at what you should do next. That's not to say, with a little bit of a pause and a breath, that acting on your fight, flight, freeze is necessarily going to be your best interest in the circumstances. So it's a great example of where we quite often feel compelled to act on our emotions, when maybe just taking a minute and thinking about whether that's really in your best interest is a really, really important thing to be able to do.
Yeah, and the problem comes when we don't get out of that fight, flight, freeze, right? That chronic stress happens and then burnout happens, which is your bag.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So you spending too long in flight, fight, freeze, your the wear and tear on your body is really quite extreme, and quite, outside of fairly extreme circumstances, it's actually not helpful for you in the social situations that we typically find ourselves in at work. So if you're not having that opportunity during the course of the day, or at the very least at the end of the day, to come back from that very extreme state of arousal, if you're not getting into recovery mode, in fact, if you're not even recognizing, and this is increasingly common, we habituate to that level of stress. If you're not recognizing that's the state that you're in, and you're not actively addressing it during the course of the day, that's when you start to get that long-term wear and tear that leads to burnout.
Yeah, and I find some people are addicted to it as well. They almost can't relax. They can't have the quiet. They can't not have the TV or music or something, or 10 different devices. We've got laptops, computers, TVs, phones, all
That's right.
on. And that time for calm, that time for quiet is really uncomfortable for some people.
Yeah, very, very uncomfortable when you're not used to it. And when it causes you to consider, I think, some of the things that may not be as aligned with what's important to you as maybe you would like them to be, that's a very uncomfortable place to be, when you pause and you realize that maybe, your life's not exactly headed in the direction that you would like it to, but it's much easier to distract yourself.
Yeah. And then we're kind of numbing our emotions when we do that because we're not listening, we're not understanding how we're feeling. We've got that that block, that distraction.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, and it works both ways. I think, as anyone who's spent any time with TED Talks and Brene Brown would know, if you're in the habit of ignoring one set of emotions, if you're in the habit of numbing the really negative emotions, it's very unlikely that you're engaging really actively with positive emotions as well. So you're kind of flat throughout.
Yeah.
That's not how we look back on a full life well lived. That's I think called languishing.
Yes. And I think you've touched on a really important point there as well. When it comes to emotions, we often perceive being emotional as a negative connotation, and being too emotional is um, used and perceived as a put down. And maybe that's the first myth that we can raise is um, emotions are irrational. What would you say to that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of my favorite myths is emotions are irrational. If we were fully functioning machines, as we're often told we should be at work, to be told that you're a machine is a high compliment. If we're in any way experiencing an emotional response to something, then that feels like a bit of a failure. So if you've bought into that myth that emotions are irrational, then all the more reason perhaps to, if you recognize that you're experiencing something emotional, to tamp that down, to ignore it, to squash it, to pretend it's not happening.
Mm.
And that's not to say that reacting and expressing every emotion that crosses your mind or crosses your body is a good idea at all. That is definitely not the solution. But being able to recognize what's going on is information. It's information about what your brain thinks you need to do next in order to survive, in order to live well. So ignoring that information is ignoring some really important clues about things like, well, what's important to me? Things that make you angry are probably instances where someone's broken a rule or crossed a line that's actually really important to you. So it's a good signal about your values, what's really, what are your priorities at work. That's an excellent thing to understand when someone's broken one of those implicit rules for you. And to be able to explain how important that is to you is a really constructive response to that emotion, as opposed to losing it, as an example.
Yeah. And I think that really ties in well with emotions are a negative thing. That it is that, positive enforcement, that understanding of the reasoning behind it and the rationality, whether it's different for the other person, but really kind of getting into, well, why am I reacting or perceiving that? And I love the things that you do and teach because it's all about the pause. It's all about the second before you react, because often when we react, it can be uncontrollable, which is the second myth that we want to bust. Because we do feel, and sometimes, especially early in our lives, that we're unable to control our emotions. But you know that that one is a myth as well. Can you bust that one for us?
Yeah, I'd love to bust that one. So emotions, particularly if you've been told that they're irrational and therefore that you're, busy ignoring them or squashing them or, otherwise tamping them down, they can start to build up. So small things add up until if you're not addressing those causes, the kind of the thing that someone has done, for example, that series of things that have happened in the environment to make you angry, when that last straw suddenly arrives and you lose it, that is the kind of counterpoint to emotions as something you shouldn't have if you're pretending that you're not having them. And those causes in your social environment are building up. Of course, at some point, you are going to then lose control of that very strong emotion that's been building all that time that you've been ignoring and not making use of. So at that point, it is going to feel quite uncontrollable. And it does just take skill and practice over time to recognize first of all, you have to recognize that emotion is happening as it's happening. And secondly, to take that minute, to take a breath, to be curious, I always like to say we should be scientists of our own emotions. So just be curious. What is it that's going on? Where are you feeling it? What happened to cause it? And where is that coming from? What beliefs do you have that have created that emotion relative to what's happened in the environment just now? What is important to you? What are the things that perhaps in your past experiences have led to that pattern? Are they really relevant to this current situation? Because that can happen as well. You can start to see past experiences in current experiences without really examining what's gone on. So be a scientist, be curious, and that all by itself gives you a little bit of space to step back and be more skillful about the way that you respond to that emotional experience. Be curious about what's going on for the other person. So when you think about the levels of emotional awareness, clearly taking that time to pause and to recognize, to name and to recognize what's going on for you, but also to do perspective taking to understand what's going on for the other person. There's very, very few situations anymore in modern life where we have a strong emotion that doesn't involve other people around us having done something good, bad, or otherwise. So taking that perspective and understanding what's going on for the other person can also really help with taking that step back, getting that distance that you need to respond skillfully and to understand how you might tackle the root cause of that very strong emotion as opposed to just responding to the emotion itself.
Yeah. And if we're distracting ourselves, if we're not looking in and saying, why am I having this? Then it does cause bigger issues, but we also don't get, as you were saying, we don't get the ability to practice, to understand. And I feel like a lot of the time, as you were saying, it's about our upbringing and it's about perceptions. And one of the other myths I want to share and chat with you about is emotions being unprofessional. And I feel we hide our emotions at work because it's not professional to bring that kind of passion or knowledge or reaction to the workplace. And yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that one.
So I think that's a really interesting one, and there's a lot of nuance to it in the sense that in some instances, the way that we react in the moment may be unprofessional. So related to what we were just talking about before, if it's a very strong emotion and you're expressing it without the skill that will enable you to connect with the people around you, then that is something that in most workplaces will be, we can talk a little bit about power differentials in a minute, but in most workplaces will be perceived as being unprofessional. So it's in the way that emotion is expressed. I think it's important to continue to keep in mind in the workplace that emotions are contagious. So whatever we bring to the emotional environment will be contagious to people around us. And vice versa. So we need to recognise when other people's expressed emotions are making us feel in a particular way, and that also gives us an opportunity to work with them and be curious. And I'm feeling a little on edge because everyone around me is feeling a little on edge. Is there any reason for me to be feeling on edge, or is it just coming from out there? So I think there are levels of skill in how you experience, how you deal with, how you express your emotions in the workplace. And at the extreme end, yes, there are instances where I would consider it, most workplaces would consider it unprofessional, but for the most part, emotions are how, as I said right at the beginning, they're how you tell whether you're working on something that's really important to you, and how people understand that from how you're behaving at work and how you're communicating at work. If you're not able to express how important something is to you or how much you love doing that work, if you try to keep all of that tamped down, then you're missing an opportunity to connect with the other people around you, and you're missing an opportunity really to kind of enjoy, to revel in, to really relish the work that you're doing as well. So quite often when we talk about emotions at work, we're always talking about the negative ones. There are also positive ones, and I think expressing those and sharing those openly, making ourselves a little bit vulnerable in the process. I'm really, we can be a little bit cynical about work, but when you really love what you're doing, sharing that is an incredibly powerful thing.
Definitely. And let's dive into what you kind of touched on just there as well, because we have seen, all of us, I'm sure, have seen people in different leadership positions manage their emotions differently than, let's say, junior staff or new staff. Can you share why perhaps they get away with it and how that impacts the culture and our own personal growth?
Yeah, so much to talk about there, Nick. So I think let's start with why. I think it's a combination of stress. So genuinely people not being very skillful about the way that they act and interact with other people around them. And also just organizational license. So if you have a very high power differential across a very hierarchical organization, and historically you have grown up with, you've been formed in an environment where it has been okay for very senior people to not filter negative emotions, to be very direct, to sometimes be very loud and aggressive. Often people will not recognize that that is not the best possible way of managing their teams, for example. It's worked for them because they're still there. They've ascended through the ranks. They've been able to absorb whatever very strong emotions have been expressed by the people who they've been led by. And so they understand that to be the way to get things done. And that, I think, if you're working with team members who respond well to that kind of communication, even if it's only in the moment, then that becomes self-reinforcing. You see that reaction. You yell jump and everybody yells how high and they all jump, and that cycle gets reinforced. Of course, I'm going to keep doing that if in the moment I get the result that I need to get. What people often don't realise, and this is where situational leadership comes in, and at the extreme end, really understanding what constitutes bullying and harassment in a workplace. But where situational leadership is important is recognising when there are members of the team who really don't respond to that kind of interaction very well. And in particular over time. So where in the moment you might get a really good response, you might get, very rapid turnaround of a piece of work, or, rapid improvement of something that someone's working on. Over time, unless you have a particularly unreactive or particularly robust team member, you're going to find that that just wears thin, which is why you see so much attrition in organisations that do have that extremely hierarchical, extremely, it's quite often described as direct management style, where it just becomes unpleasant, and it's not a thing that most teams want to work with over a long period of time. But there's also just that core element of skill and stress. So if you've got leaders who are constantly under stress, they may intend to operate better than they do, and they just find that they can't do it in the moment.
Yeah, and we've all found ourselves there. So yeah, as you said before, we need to see it from the other person's side of things. But as a leader, you've got a responsibility, and even to be able to say to someone, "Look, I'm really stressed and stretched at the moment, so I apologize if it's come across in a way that has been aggressive or angry. That's not how I meant. However, this is what I'm dealing with," and just being open and transparent and being in the
100% agree.
yeah, you wish you had.
Yeah. Rupture and repair, right? It's like any relationship. Maybe you don't live up to the standard that you would like to achieve in the workplace, but at least addressing it after the fact and saying, look, I'd really like to do better than that.
Mm. So can you give us some tips on how we can deal with our emotions more skillfully? You have shared a couple, but if you can kind of wrap it up in a bow for people to say, oh, I kind of feel like I've heard myself in this conversation. Go
So
away.
I find it helpful to think about those levels in terms of a ladder almost. So when you're out of practice, when you have been taught not to pay attention, the starting point is just to notice. I'm feeling great. Where's that coming from? What kind of day have I had? How do I make more of these days happen? Or I'm feeling not so great. I'm feeling quite unsettled. Noticing how you're feeling in your body is a great starting point, and then putting a name to it. And the more precisely you can name that emotion, the more nuanced combination of different words, for example. Or one of my favorite tips is from Lisa Feldman Barrett, who's a researcher in the US. She likes to find words in other languages that express a particular emotion in a way that we don't have a single word for in English. So being really precise about that. So her example is, or perhaps actually a better one is making up words for situations that you find yourself in. So she said, the word that I made up the other day was that feeling of when you reach into the packet of chips and you realize that you already ate all of the chips. And that feeling is called chiplessness. So you can have some fun with it, come up with really good, precise names for how you're feeling. And then, as importantly, start to think about, so once you kind of go through all of those phases, start to think about what's going on for the other person in that situation. So what perhaps were they feeling coming into the interaction? What's going on for them? What are some different explanations perhaps than the one that you automatically came up with based on sort of patterns of what you've seen before? What else could be happening for that person? All of those stages give you a little bit of an increase. Each of them gives you more distance on what's happened and more distance on your emotion to work out what's the skillful thing. Do I need to do anything at all here? Perhaps I can just let that go. Or, no, this is something that's important enough to me to address with that person or with those people in a calm and quite measured way, as opposed to that more perhaps stereotypical way of reacting on an emotion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's also good for someone who has had let's say, an emotional aggressive reaction to do exactly what you've said as well, to say, oh, how has this come across? How could it potentially be perceived? What could the other person be thinking and feeling right now? And is there anything I need to do or say to maybe clear the air so that it doesn't become a psychosocial hazard?
Mm-hmm.
Lead to psychological harm, because it's little things like incivility that lead to that, and creating a positive culture where you can make mistakes, you can fail, it's not a problem. I see so many organizations say that, yes, we fail forward, but then don't actually allow for failure. So we need to give
Mm.
them a bit of a break as well. Um, but be able to say, hey, like I apologize, and that might have come across this way, or even ask, how did that come across to you? How are you feeling right now? And be okay with apologizing.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I think there's an element also of what happened before that interaction. So if I come from a place of trust and a good, stable, mutually respectful relationship with someone who I'm working for in this instance, so I've got a leader who I know has my back, then I will give that leader a lot more leeway to have a bit of a tanty occasionally and not take it too personally, because I will know that person well enough to know that it's out of the ordinary, and I will have enough faith in our relationship to know that a bad day or an off interaction or a bit of impatience is not a threat to my safety in that relationship.
Mm.
So I think there's an element of you get more get out of jail free cards if you've invested in the relationship to begin with, and you don't want to rely on them. That's not what I'm saying at all. But there is that you get a lot more, you know, you get a lot more buffer, if you like, yeah, with the people you're working with, if you've actually invested in getting to know them and they feel safe with you to begin with. So there's that element of creating the foundation before you worry too much about the individual instances.
Exactly. And then that gives them the ability to speak up and say something to you as well, to say, look, I know that's out of your character, or I know things are really stressful, maybe something's going on at home, but do you realize that you have done X, Y, and Z in this meeting? And I probably reckon you should check in with them, because it goes both ways, and they're able to kind of have your back as well as your leader having
That's
you.
right.
Yeah. That's where we want to get to, right? That's long and short of it, is building those relationships so everyone can support each other, and we can stuff up, and still have each other's back and still support each other, and move forward from it, and rather than it having it being a sticking point and causing harm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Helen. I really love our conversations. They always go in great directions. If people want to get in contact with you, what's the best way to do that?
So me directly, I would go to LinkedIn and just reach out. I'm very happy to connect with anyone who's interested. Reach out on email. You can reach me on hello@thisisyourtank.com, or jump on the website, which you'll also find the contact details for on there, which is thisisyourtank.com.
Fantastic. And thank you so much again, Helen. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Nick. Always a pleasure to chat.